Okay, sorry. So this working group is about UCL, the Universal Config Language. And the basic goal is to help us develop kind of the template and the philosophy that we'll use in applying this to as many of the utilities in the base system as we can, with the goal being to make config files that are easy for humans to edit and maintain, but are also able to be read from and written to programmatically. So, from your management system or your control plane or whatever else you might need to do. So to start, we'll have a quick overview of what is UCL, and then Velesavad will present some more stuff about his work on that. And then I have my work in progress showing the conversion I have for new syslog and what that might look like. And I've also recently done one for Beehive. So you can save your Beehive configurations in a file and launch them from that instead. And I've used a slightly different approach with each. And we can kind of compare and contrast and decide which type of approach probably makes the most sense. And it kind of digs into the next stuff, which are what are some of the common requirements of config files, and how do we want to deal with those, and how can we make the best config files possible, including some common set of features that we can apply to every config file, no matter what the program that the config file for is actually doing. Some of the ideas were stolen from existing things like the enabled keyword in the package config. So, by default, there's the FreeBSD repo installed on your system, and that's where you get packages from. If you provide your own repo in a different file, you set FreeBSD enabled equals no, and all of a sudden that repo isn't used anymore without having to go and change the default file. And that's the kind of concept that I would like to see applied to a lot more things, so that my configuration can build on top of what's there without having to disturb it, especially anything that's shipped with FreeBSD. Right? I don't want to edit the files that are shipped by FreeBSD. I want to just apply my local changes and keep them separate. And so then, depending on the number of those we have, should those be in a separate namespace? And what if an application has a keyword enabled? How do we make sure that doesn't conflict? And then once you have multiple config files that you can layer on top of each other, you have to store them in somewhere. And then because in FreeBSD we also have the separation between the base system and the ports, you can end up with quite a string of paths that your config files can end up in. And how do we deal with that? And then, in order to programmatically edit config files from the command line, you're going to need a tool. And so I present UCL CMD, which probably needs a better name. But it's a command line interface for UCL that I wrote because I wanted to use libucl from a shell script. And so it can do a number of the things that we're looking at, and hopefully we'll grow the functionality to do a few more things. And then once we've decided how to do it, we have to make a list of which programs we should UCLify and how quickly, which things are priorities for us. And to do that, we need a better way of converting the programs, right? In most applications, the config gets loaded and put into a struct of some kind. But each application is going to be different, so how do we make that adapter between the UCL objects we load from the config file to putting them where the program is going to look for them to avoid having to rototill the entire program? So what is the universal config language? It was written by Velesavad based on his frustrations. But it's basically inspired by the bind or nginx config syntax that most sysadmins are already familiar with. But it's even more flexible because, quoting stuff is optional. You might want it if it's a string, but if you're just putting one word as, or yes or no, it doesn't require that. But also things like the semicolon at the end of the line are optional. You can have it or you cannot. And it's compatible with JSON. But the problem with using JSON for a config file is that A, no comments, and B, it's very strict. Right? If you have an array of something, you have to not have a comma after the last item or it breaks. And bunch of things like that. UCL makes it much more sane by allowing you to have that extra comma without exploding in your face. And it can also do YAML plus its own thing. But for config files, it also has handy things like suffixes. So if you set max size equals 100K, it'll automatically expand that to mean 100,000. Or 100KB to be 100 times 1024. Or you can say 5 min, and it does it every 5 minutes. Or D for days, or whatever you want to do. So it has all these little syntax sugar type things that just make the life of the sysadmin that much easier. And the best part is that your config file can end up being as simple or as complex as you want. Right? You can have simple just key value pairs, or you can have nesting and all the stuff you would see in like Nginx, where you get 3 or 4 different blocks inside of each other. It has inline comments in both config file syntax and C syntax. It has a validation and schema verification engine. My tool doesn't use that yet, but the general idea is you'd be able to very quickly make sure the config file is valid before you start trying to parse it. Or, for example, check it before you restart the daemon or whatever. But the other thing is libucl itself provides support for includes. So instead of having to write an include subsystem into each daemon, like Brian Drury did for new syslog, this is kind of a generic way where by implementing UCL, every application will gain support for the include macro. And you can also do your own macros, and you can have inline variables, where the application can say, before it loads the config file, here's a bunch of variables that you might end up using in your config file, and then you just use them in the config file, but when it parses it, they get expanded to the actual value that you were expecting. So UCL can look like that or like that, whichever way you like.
So can I ask a question now?
Yes, please.
Okay. When you do expansion of things, do you keep track of the original syntactic representation so that when you re-output UCL, it goes back to 100K rather than 100,000, or it keeps track of the fact that you're using a variable name?
Currently, it doesn't. That's one of the things Sabriel wants to address in his presentation in a few minutes. Because yes, that's the problem, is that if you use my tool to make one change to your config file, all of those things get expanded, and all of a sudden, instead of saying 5 days, it says how many ever seconds there are in 5 days, which becomes less readable. And it also currently strips out the comments. But he has 2 different ideas on how to solve that, and would like some feedback on which one people think will be better. But as you can see, you can pretty much write it in any of the config syntaxes you've ever worked with before, and it will just work. But obviously, for a universal config file we want to define for FreeBSD, we might want to be a little specific about whether we want semicolons at the end of every line or not. But we have quite a bit of flexibility as far as what's valid. And then the include system, which is still my favorite part of it, has a bunch of controls and options for it. The first one is the try setting, which is just a Boolean, and basically allows you to decide if include this file, and if that file doesn't exist, is that fatal or not? And then you can also do globbing, so you can include star.conf from a directory or something. You can also include from a URL that will either use libfetch or libcurl.
I'm not sure if this is the right time for this question, but the star.conf thing is very common in Linux, and it leads to all manner of pain because there's no defined ordering.
Right.
And you install a new package, and now its .conf file gets loaded in the middle of a load of other .conf files and overwrites the key that one of the earlier ones set. Now, how do they compose?
Pardon?
We do this for your conf files upon installation.
Currently, libucl uses the libc blob expansion, so I guess the order is not very deterministic.
So I think that should give you alphabetical order for this.
Yeah.
It's not very human-friendly to try and
Force the order by sticking numbers in front of it or some ugly hack like that. Pardon?
Just uses a priority flag inside Postman.
Right. So there are two approaches for this. There's the priority macro, or sorry, the priority setting of the include. So when you're doing an include, you can say this file has a higher priority than this file. But when you do the glob, that priority applies to everything that matches the glob. But separately, and since I wrote these slides, I've added the dot priority macro, which when you set it with a number, everything that appears after that until the next one has the different priority. So you can actually set a certain section to be a higher priority inside one specific file. And then it won't matter what order it's included in.
It might also be nice to have requires or include before or something that will.
Yeah, some kind of ordering. Yeah, yes, that's a good idea. Yes?
And on a related note, can you define variables in one config file that then are used in another config file that has said I need to
Not currently, the variables that get expanded in a config file have to be set by the program that's going to parse all the config files, right?
Yes, variables are not set from the configuration files themselves, so you can set variables only from C API.
But it seems like it would be really useful to have some top level or first config file that says my web root is at this path.
Yes.
Actually, it's trivial to do with macros. So you can just add some macro called, variables, dot variables equal to some file, and that's all basically.
Okay.
Because that's actually one of the blockers for the replacement of jail.conf, because a bunch of the stuff has self-referencing variables, because it has lazy expansion or whatever. So you can include files remotely with curl or fetch, and it has a system to cryptographically sign the config files and only load them if they're OK. Have you used that much? I've not played with it.
I've used it several times, but
Yeah, OK.
I don't like the current approach with RSA because I'm not a big fan of RSA.
Yeah.
But that's all that's supported by OpenSSL, and I'm willing to refactor this in some future versions of
Right.
UCL, but I don't like it.
Since I wrote these slides, Baptiste has made me add a bunch more features. There's now a paths parameter where you can give it an array of paths to search. So when you say include pkg.conf, it will search through a list of paths. And if glob is false, it will stop after it finds the first match. And if it's true, even if you don't have a wildcard character, it will load all of them that match.
Are we inventing a programming language here? LibUCL is actually bigger than a JavaScript interpreter now.
Is it? It seems pretty small.
So duct tape compiles down to about 100K of binary. And as a straw man idea, maybe if we're trying to generate programs, then we should just use a programming language. But we probably don't want a Turing complete config file language.
Right.
Actually, in my product called Responsive, I'm using the macro named .lua. So you can just build a bridge between UCL and Lua in a very straightforward way. So there is basically two ways direction between UCL and Lua. So you can just get any object in Lua and pass it to UCL, including functions, including callbacks, and so on and so forth.
I'm just going to repeat that. I don't think we want a Turing complete configuration file format.
Yes, that's an extension. That's not a mandatory.
Yeah. And the other one it added was the nested keyword, or I think it's called prefix now. I'm changing my mind about it. Anyway, it allows when you're including a separate file to put all of its content in a subkey instead of in the root in case you want to containerize it or whatever.
With the URL, is it possible to disable including from URL?
It's off by default. You have to specifically turn it on
Okay.
to
So
use it.
If there is a config file that does say include from URL, then it won't automatically go do that unless I force that to be turned on.
Right? URL loading is off by default, right? You have to set something to make it do it,
They're
right?
loaded on parsing.
Hmm?
They're loading in the parsing process. So if it figures out that there is include of URL, it resolves it synchronously.
Right.
So just URL the parsing.
Right, so I guess the question is, should we have a parsing flag to explicitly disable includes via URL?
I don't know.
We should, because there are.
Yeah. Yeah,
Like libxml, libxml2 has quite a few number of vulnerabilities, and that's one of the things that you have to disable. And when ClamAV integrated with libxml2 to parse DMG files, the ClamAV developers didn't know about the disable network access flag that you tell libxml2, and introduced an inherent vulnerability that then you can tell ClamAV's libxml2 parser to go to a URL, download this XML document that will then exploit libxml2 and give you a shell.
yeah.
So we need to be able to disable
That in the C API, or have it off by default, and you have to enable it in the C API before you can include a URL.
I would prefer disabled by default.
Yeah.
But you might also want to be able to disable it at a file granularity. So say I'm going to include system config files.
With URLs and
They can have URLs if they want. Now I'm going to include the user ones that I don't trust as much.
Right.
URL.
because another one I considered recently was like something you would set where it says don't load the config file if the modes on it would allow someone other than the owner to write to it, kind of like we do for SSH key directory and stuff. I don't know how big of a deal that is, but it might be worth having.
Well, that would be particularly if you were going to say within a config file itself, here's where you can find all the public keys that
Right.
I trust to sign
Mm-hmm.
things.
Yeah. Yes.
Config file can actually say, hey, go to this URL and get it. If not that, drop back to this other local one.
Not currently.
Okay.
It's actually one of the goals in my roadmap because I want to have some sort of detached signatures for each configuration file that could be checked by some trusted public key or DNSSEC or Jane or whatever. But this is not the priority task now.
Okay. Do you want to do yours now?
So you're finished?
Well, I have more, but it's like code examples and stuff, so we should do yours first. So they have an idea of some of the problems and the possible solutions before I show them how horrible my code is.
Speaking of the signing each file thing, the other mode that you might want to support is the signing of a tree of files. If you take the graph of all the files that have been included and hash them all together.
Actually, that's the mode that is supported by my library called Signify, which is very similar to Signify and OpenBSD. And basically, it does support this mode currently. So there are no problems with this mode, basically. The only case is how to link them all together.
Yeah, it's very important then that you have a deterministic ordering for them.
Yeah.
This is the room microphone,
Okay.
so they can hear you, and then this is the one so that they can hear you in the recording.
Don't actually know where I should be recorded because it's not very well prepared speech. Just
Be fine.
Well, actually, I wanted to talk about UCL in terms of C API and the overview of UCL and how to use it in your C programs, in base system programs, and in utilities, and for different purposes. Finally, I want to discuss the current issues with libucl and maybe to provide some approaches just to select between alternatives.
Page down, not by the arrow keys.
Hmm?
To switch slides, use page down.
Okay. No, it doesn't work.
Click the mouse and then go. Oh, sorry. The zoom is off now. See the top, the 400%. Can you
get the page.
Doesn't work.
Page.
Page fit.
Yes, free. Click and now does it work? There you go. Sorry.
Okay. So basically, here are some advantages of using libucl for C programmers. First of all, there are many abilities that are provided by libucl that are not included in the C standard library. Basically, all UCL objects can work in zero copy mode, so you don't need to copy keys, values, and so on and so forth. So all strings in UCL are not actually copied unless you explicitly define that you want to have zero terminated strings. So basically, they're stored as fixed length strings, and so they can be zero copied when transferring and so on. Also, it provides reference counting using atomic operations, and all objects can be used by references. And basically, if you have a constant pointer, then it is not referenced. And if you need to modify it or to save it somewhere, then you just need to increase the reference count. Moreover, all objects in UCL can be represented by dictionaries. So you can use associated arrays in C, and since I'm using rather fast library called K library and key hashes in particular, they are really very efficient. So it's closed hash that is proven to be very fast. So there are many benchmarks, and I've just selected the fastest implementation of hash tables. Similarly, you can use automatically growing arrays. So they are not linked list. Initially, they were linked list, but afterwards, I found that vectors are much faster than linked list because of cache locality. So there is a simple example of using UCL API. So you create objects, then you create some keys in this object. These keys can be different types. There are several flags for strings, for example. So you can just trim strings, removing unnecessary spaces. You can also parse values like true, false, or numbers. And basically, you can remove case, add case, include one object to another, and so on and so forth. Moreover, the last example is how to create dynamic arrays by means of UCL. So you can just append, prepend, pop objects, push objects, and so on. So this API can be used to simplify the development in general. And basically, I'm using UCL and UCL API in many of my applications, and I feel that it is much simpler than to manage with different, system types. For example, if you use something like sysqh, it is good. It has very rich API, but on the other hand, it uses linked lists, and in performance critical applications, it is not a good idea to use linked lists. Right.
We think that config file parsing is on the fast path?
It is not the fast path. So I'm using UCL for exchanging data between C modules.
Okay.
So I'm just using UCL like as variant object. So to return it, to get it, and in package we use UCL objects just to represent the whole package. And there is a simple parser that directly convert the UCL object to the plain C structure. And there is an API, which is not public because we have not decided how to create it, and about how to convert a UCL object to a plain C structure. Because you want to use plain C structure, for example, to access keys, values, and so on and so forth. And another advantage that is also zero copy. So we just parse this UCL using some iterator and fill the target structure with no problems.
Sorry, can I ask a follow-up on that?
Mm-hmm.
I can stop bugging you, but you get
Right.
Do you have bindings for working with other, like, so, you know, for instance, dynamic languages that have reflection, you might like to pull things out easily?
I'll talk about it a bit later.
Okay.
Just, yeah. So you can also extend UCL. So you can extend it by using macros, defining your own macroses, and modifying the existing macroses, and so on and so forth. And also you can define your own variables that provides replacement in the code. And also in variables you can provide a generic callback for all unknown variables if you need. So for example, from the side of input file macro is something like dot macro unnecessary params, which is another UCL object. So you can just embed into these params all UCL objects that are valid, but not at some extent you can't use, for example, another macro in these parameters because it's very bad. Yeah, and you can use single line and multi-line values as body of the macro. From the perspective of C developer, macro handler is quite simple. So it accepts the body of macro, which is fixed length string. Then it accepts objects as parsed UCL object, and some Apache user data pointer that is specified when you register this macro. So you can just organize passing of your own structures into macro handlers. And on the invocation of macro, you can just see that the state diagram is quite simple. So it accepts arguments in ordinary braces, and macro body is either in quotes or in curly braces if you need multi-line macros. Basically, UCL tries to parse these arguments in a very strange way, because you need to somehow hide braces inside of the arguments. So it tries to calculate pairs for the opening and closing braces, and not to count braces that are inside of the arguments as terminating braces. But that's, I don't like it actually, but it was the only way how to do it, unfortunately. So the missing features that I know about are the following. So many people want to have some context preserving when parsing macros. For example, here is an example of macro that requires to save context. But the problem is that macros are not lazily parsed. So they are parsed as is, as in place. And in this case, there is no full context of the UCL object. And I don't know how to solve this problem, basically. So probably we can just extend API of macro registers that this macro should be parsed only after all context is obtained. But I just don't know how to do it properly, right?
So, I mean, if you look at libucl as a compiler, which I think is a reasonable way to look at it, then for every object that you keep track of, you have to just explicitly keep track of where it came from so that you have the original syntactic information.
Yeah, that's another problem.
I mean, so you just augment UCL object T to have a source location and
Yeah.
Everything else.
Actually, I'll talk a bit later about this, because this is very closely related to other problems. Because I need somehow to save the context, and saving of context has different ways how to do it. And yeah, I need to. All right, a bit later. Another problem is that all such modifications would just break the existing API. So I don't really want to do it. So I want basically to extend API, but this is so-called Windows way, because you can have function, then function full, then function v2, then function extended v2, and so on and so forth. That's bad. I don't know how to do it in a more simpler way, because there is no ways how to provide optional parameters in C. You know, that's the limitation of language, and I don't know whether there is a simple way to overcome this. And so there is the same problem when you emit UCL file. All macros are lost because there is no context preservation. Variables are quite a simple structures, so you can just replace a variable with its value, and that's all. You can use either variables in curly braces, or you can just type something like $, a variable, and that's all. And from C perspective, it is even simpler, so you can just provide a variable and its replacement, and that's all. The problem comes when there is unknown variables. So you don't know what this variable should be substituted with. And in this case, the current API has a special function that allows you to specify a callback for unknown variables. So if you don't know this variable, then this callback is called, and you can either replace variable or leave it as is, or remove it, or whatever. So by using of this logic, you can just manage how variables are extended, including unknown ones, including some advanced substitutions, and so on and so forth. But there is one problem with this. So for example, for this unknown variables handler, the callback structure is very complicated. So it accepts data, length. It might specify the targeting replacement in this replace argument, and you need to set replace len. Unfortunately, somehow you may need to free this variable because it can be dynamically allocated, and that's really a very complicated API. And I don't know how to make it simpler, because it is expected to be a sort of very advanced mechanism to manage with variables, including unknown variables. But yeah, and there is a certain ambiguity when you parse unknown variables, and there is no callback for interacting with the rest of API. The problem is that if UCL cannot expand variable, it just leave it as is. So depending on C API, $variable can be either a $variable or some replacement, and I think that's bad. Especially it's bad in the last form when you just specify $variable without curly braces, because it might confuse the overall parsing. Obviously, you can just escape this symbol by backslash, but that's not a very comfortable option. So now some words about bindings. So currently there is a binding to Lua, which is bidirectional. So it can you can save basically all objects of Lua for UCL and vice versa. So all UCL are valid Lua objects, and they're converted to each other without any overhead. For dynamic reflections, you can use C++ 11 version. So there is API called 2JSON, and if any object in C++, sorry, not 2JSON, 2UCL, and if any object in C++ has 2UCL option method, then it is explicitly could be converted to UCL by this method. Also, there are two methods for something that looks like array, which is sequential iterator, and something that looks like map. So if you pass something like unordered map, or other types that has the same API, it is automatically extended to the UCL object. So you can convert any STL or boost object that satisfies these properties to UCL directly. And there is binding for Python. Unfortunately, I have nothing related. I have no ideas about how it works because I don't use Python, but it exists in UCL currently. And there are some external contributions of UCL bindings to Go language and to Rust. I don't know, unfortunately, how they work. Also, there is a binding for PHP, and I think that's all. I've not heard about other bindings. So, for example, here is interaction between UCL and Lua. So it is defined the table in Lua that includes many options, and afterwards it is converted to UCL configuration and could be passed either to C or to, JSON and whatever you want, whatever output format you want. So basically, that was designed to provide a convenient way to pass any Lua objects to UCL and vice versa. So from C you can, okay.
How much work, like how many lines of code sort of thing is it to write new bindings?
That depends on how FFI are organized, I'd say, because for C++, it is rather natural. For something like Go, as far as I remember, there are about 500 lines of code for bindings. But it depends on which functionality do you want to export and so on.
So I'm thinking about things like, Qt will have a Q variant type, or glib will have a G variant type, which, those are C or C++ language things. Is it going to be a huge amount of work to write bindings for those, or is that pretty easy? Or libenv, for instance, which we use elsewhere.
I don't know.
Fair enough.
Because for Lua it was simple. For Lua it was just two methods, to UCL and from UCL, that's all. From UCL is used from C API, and to UCL is used from Lua. And also there is a support of custom emitting functions. For example, you can create your own emitter to different type of objects. For example, you can emit UCL object to file descriptor, to stdio file object, to dynamic extended string, and so on and so forth. Also, you can add your own formats. Currently, there is support for JSON, pretty JSON, which is linked to JSON with tabs and so on. Embedded YAML. UCL is just configuration in human readable format, and recently I've added message pack support as emitter. There is also support of streamline emitters, so you can just open object and add keys as much as you want. So they are not stored in memory explicitly, so you don't need to store them. That's good if you want to output a big object, for example, from some parsing utility to another utility and so on. Unfortunately, some formats do not support streamline. For example, message pack. The problem here is that there are no streamline objects or arrays. In CBOR format, there is support for the streamlining objects and arrays, but currently UCL does not support CBOR. This is in plans, but not in the recent ones. So, for example, here is a custom function to emit to glib gstring. So you can define a set of functions, for example, to append character, to append length, so any buffer, to append integers, because different output can have different emitting types for integers and doubles and so on. And afterwards, you can just emit objects to this structure. So it was used to replace the default emitters to glib gstrings. Well, so the biggest unresolved problem is how to save context. So I have two approaches for dealing with this problem. The first approach is to save positions just inside objects, but I don't like this option. I'll explain a bit later. And another option is to create some sort of shadow context. So you copy the full original representation, and afterwards augment all your objects with the positions in the original objects. But this approach has certain problems as well. And another issue is the ambiguity of API when dealing with implicit arrays, but I'll tell about it later. So if you keep data in objects, it is relatively cheap in terms of memory and processing, so you don't need to copy the original data. That's good. But other things are disadvantages. But the positions of additional elements can be very ambiguous. So for example, you had a comment and an object, and afterwards you removed this object, and therefore you will remove all linked comments and all. But comments can be before object or after object or within object and so on. So it's very complicated to define the concrete position of the comment and how it's related to the object. So some comments may be unrelated to any objects. They be just, I would like to comment this big piece of configuration and that's all. So it can be unrelated to any objects. There is nothing to do with macros, with variables. With variables, it can be possible to implement this, but the logic is very bad. There is...
What's the problem with macros?
When you interpret the config file, macro will be expanded and replaced with its
Yeah.
Sure, but if you just also keep track of the original document and how...
It is not this approach. It is the approach how to save this additional data within objects. It's not the original data, it is additional data. Yeah, and it is very complex, unfortunately. So another option is to save shadow context. So you save the original copy and store the original positions of objects inside objects. So it is just offsets from the beginning in the original context. So in this way, you can just store macros and so on. But disadvantages are obvious, so you need to store everything in memory. And basically, you need somehow to, if you run this in zero copy mode, that's fine. You still need to preserve the overall structure of document in memory, but that's not a problem. So you can just represent all objects as references to the specific offsets in the original object. Another problem is how to work with different emitters. So for example, your input is UCL, which supports macros, comments, and so on and so forth. And you want to emit to a message pack that doesn't have these features. And you need somehow to... actually, that's not a problem of UCL itself. It's the problem of output formats. And it's not really limiting. And basically, it can deal with macros and variables in rather straightforward way. The problem in this approach is that when you return UCL object to C API, your API users can modify these objects. And there is no way how to detect whether this or that object was modified. So I don't know how to solve this. The only way I thought about is to save the checksum of the value. But it's rather expensive, and in terms of objects, you need to save not a checksum of the individual object, but checksums of all objects inside, and that's quite complicated. So that's the unanswered question. So I don't know what to do with unknown modifications. Well, and the last issue is how to deal with implicit arrays. So Alan recently added the feature to disable implicit arrays at all. So when you parse objects, all implicit arrays are converted to explicit arrays. And that's good for many things, but it's bad in terms of if you can have a single value or multiple value. So Again, I don't know how to solve this problem without breaking compatibility and without reducing our functionality. So obviously, if you specify this flag, then all values that can be arrays would be arrays. And in this case, you need to modify your API. But the current approach is to iterate through the linked lists, and it's not good in all cases because you don't know whether there are a single object or multiple objects, and there is no way how to distinguish between these options. In case of explicit arrays, you can obviously check the type, and if it's array, then you deal it as array. And if it's a single object, you just deal with it as with single object. And basically, it's complex to convert these implicit arrays to some structures in JSON because JSON does not allow this. And the problem is that if you convert from UCL to JSON and back to UCL, then the representation of document is different. So that's the incompatibility with JSON in terms of base model. When you disable implicit arrays, then it's okay. Because if they are explicit arrays in the internal representation, they are explicit arrays in JSON, and they are explicit arrays in UCL. So it's just a syntax sugar for explicit arrays. So that are basically open questions.
Well, it can depend. Like in your case there, where you have two sections with the same name,
yeah,
the object ends up being an array. But if you only have one, then it stays being.
Yeah, it is an object. That's the problem.
Yeah, and I ran into that one with Beehive. It's like I want to have a section for this is a disk, but I might have more than one, or I might not.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. So
Yeah.
it's very hard to distinguish between array and object.
And
this,
is, if you're using the no implicit arrays flag, when you input the config, it looks like that. When you output it, it becomes an array instead.
yeah, it is.
And your config file is changed in a way the user didn't expect.
But anyway, it will be changed if you output this as JSON.
Yeah.
So it doesn't preserve the data model. And I think it's not a good idea. So I added this just for this feature because I wanted it. Because I wanted to be like Nginx config. Yeah. And this is like Nginx syntax. But it's not very compatible with JSON data model.
That's JSON's problem.
Yeah.
So does that imply you're going to remove it and turn it off?
Pardon?
Does your comment mean that you're going to remove it or turn it off? Or?
It can be turned off. But in this case, you need somehow to distinguish in your API between object and array. So if you have one section, then it's object. And if you have two sections, it's array. That's the problem.
Yeah.
It seems like a kind of procedure should be.
Yeah, in a current approach, so you can just use implicit arrays. You see, you can just treat it as object, and afterwards iterate over the linked list of this object. So it's like multi-value k-value mapping. So it's the analogous of multi-map data structure in C++, for example. So you can use a single k and multi-values. But that's not correct in JSON data model. And with explicit arrays, you need somehow to distinguish between these values. And
So, can I make a suggestion?
yes, that's why I'm here.
Yeah, I guess that's why we have a working group, isn't it? It seems like a lot of the issues that you're encountering, whether it's talking about incompatibilities of formats, or whether it's talking about the difficulties of parsing and then re-emitting stuff that's consistent with what was originally there, a lot of these problems come down to the fact that I think you're conflating two things. When you're parsing, construct an AST, and then you convert that into something that has evaluated values that you actually go and do something with. And right now you're skipping the middle step. Right? So if you are taking a configuration file and you're adding something new in the middle and you want to pop a new, or you want to stick something in between two existing values and you want the comments not to move around, that's really easy if you have an AST. Right? And then it's really easy to dump it back out in exactly the same format that you were using before. If you skip and go all the way to, well, now let me get an object that I can actually have, okay, I've evaluated that this is equal to 42, then it's much harder.
Yeah, I know that. Basically, I actually really want to implement a sort of AST parsing because it enables a very cool feature of streamline parsing. So you can just get a small portion of object and use incremental parsing and so on and so forth. In the current approach, incremental parsing is impossible because you need the full context to parse it. But the major disadvantage of AST is speed, basically. Speed.
Yeah.
Because you need to create an intermediate representation of all UCL objects. And afterwards, you need to convert them to hash table from AST. But yes, it is very cool to preserve everything. And I think about how to revoke and how to do these tasks simultaneously. So you can do some sort of fast path and slow path.
But again, I think that the process of going from a textual format that was written by a sysadmin, converting that into the in-memory binary representation, that's not something that is going to be on the critical path of any performance critical system. Going from your in-memory binary representation to and from some C structure might be something you do fast. But the parsing step, I think, doesn't need to be all that fast. And I think that if you had an AST representation, then the tools that you want to write in terms of machine munging of config files while preserving a bunch of things but changing a couple of things, that would all become really simple and straightforward.
Yeah, that's true.
It's worth looking at what Apple does with property lists for exactly this, because
Right.
They don't have all the flexibility of this. There's some really nice stuff that you do that they don't. But they discovered that when you provide property lists, people use them. And that kind of sucks. Because you design this thing that's really nice and friendly and human readable and great and fast to parse if you have a few hundred lines. And then people decide to use it to store the Safari history, which is 40 megs of text. So they have a very fast and dense binary encoding. But you wouldn't ever use the binary encoding for things that you expected to be human editable. It's just there and it's the same APIs. And you can say, well, actually I do want to edit this now, so use PL util to convert into the text representation. But no one expects that to be fast.
All right. That's fair enough. Yes, actually, I think that the AST approach is the only way to save this. Because you need, anyway, this copy of the context, and then you build AST on top of it. And afterwards, you convert this AST in form of compiling this AST or parsing it in post-order order.
And what you might find is if you have something that is very complex in terms of macro instantiations and things, you'll effectively do the sendmail thing and say, take all of these nice human readable configuration files. I use that in the loosest possible sense of the word for sendmail configuration. But then spit me out something that has done all the macro instantiation and just is JSON or whatever, or a binary representation like libenv. And then that's the thing that you'll actually parse on a regular basis, and you'll only generate that once when you make configuration file changes.
Yeah, that's possible. Well, so I'm basically done with internal stuff.
Thank you. They eventually got the hint. Wonderful. All right then. Okay, so to give you kind of a look at it, this is my review on Fabricator of converting new syslog. This is the log rotate thing. Can you turn the comments off? Anyway, so in this quick example, this is taking the config file for new syslog. And you can see as a comment at the top of a section, I have what the original file looked like. Because there are a couple of things wrong with new syslog. The first one being it has a flags field that are just a bunch of random letters for controlling the compression. Yes, but they're not random, sorry. The biggest problem is the very last field, which can be overloaded if the contents of the field starts with a slash, it's the path to a PID file. If it doesn't, it's a command that should be run. Yes, and you have to specify that in the flag, I think. Or no, you don't. But if you do set a certain flag, that field then becomes instead the signal number that you should send.
Yep.
Yeah.
I've made pretty money off of syslog.com.
Yeah. Well, I'm about to ruin your entire business. This is actually an older version of the config. That's sick. So if we look at this newer version, okay. So in this version, instead, we specify with sane fields like file, mode, count, size. The when field is still, I kept the original format. A better format might make more sense. I'm not sure how to do it. My first instinct was to do it with cron tab style, and then my immediate reaction was I want to replace the cron tab style as well, so that wouldn't be anyway. But instead of a flag J, you set compress equals yes, no, or a specific compressor. The size can use the kilobyte automatic expansion from UCL and so on. And you can do other things like if you need the file to be created, if it didn't exist, you just put create equals yes. And
so what does @0101t mean?
I have no bloody idea. That's from the original config file.
So that might also be a good candidate for this kind of expansion.
Yes.
It's 1 minute past 1 minute.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you not know that? Isn't that obvious?
The T indicates that it's a time instead of a. It can also be a few other things. I didn't want to. This is the very first thing I ever wrote in C, and so I didn't want to change more of new syslog. I didn't want to bite off more than I could chew at a time.
So now that you have new experience, would you consider this?
Yeah, fixing that would be good. Yes.
Well, that probably comes from the ISO 8 standard.
No, I think it comes from somebody made it up. Is it? Okay.
Yeah, there's 2 different ones.
Yep. And you can choose which one you prefer.
Yes, so this one has a $sign, and then that's the 0th day of the month or something, right? 0th day once a month or something. It's something like that. And so on. So this looks a little better, and the PID file thing, you just specify a PID file, and if you don't, then it doesn't there. So that's really just what the config. The biggest advantage to this is currently we ship new syslog with a bunch of default stuff in etc. The idea here would be to take the current config file and move that to etc defaults, and then just in your etc new syslog.conf, you would just say, actually for the xfer log, I only want to keep 1 worth of history. So you would just have xfer log count equals 1, and that was it. And then that way you're not changing the default file. But anyway, the code is the part you actually want to look at, right? Yes. I think I can just look at the rod diff. There we go. There we go. So what I did was in the original config parsing function here, we just read the first line of the file and check for it actually starting with hashtag FUCL. Just
How do you pronounce that?
it's the FreeBSD universal config file language. Anyway, and then get a version number, which is the digits that come after that before the new line character. And if that's not there, we rewind the pointer or the file pointer to the beginning of the file and continue parsing the original config file format that FreeBSD is shipped with previously. But if that is there, then we parse it with UCL.
Why not just try to parse it with UCL, and if it fails, then you fall back on the other? That will prevent having to write some default comment on top.
I think it's not a good idea because UCL can parse too many stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like Perl 6. So you can
Try
just
to have something,
bang your head to
and
the
first thing is the version of the configuration file. So if you don't have the key of this version, then it means you're not on the file, even if you manage to parse.
That might work.
Right, so that's basically what this does is it has a version in the comment at the very beginning of the file so that ideally it could actually, when the first iteration of this doesn't work out like we want it, we can just do FUCL2. And if you have a file that has 1, it'll use the old parser, and if it's 2, it'll use the new one. Obviously, that will eventually be bad, but yes. More code.
After 20 years, you just remove the old one.
Yeah, exactly. But so that's the adapter I stuck in since we can't just change the config file overnight. And then the parser, again, this was the very first C I ever wrote, so don't blame me for how horrible it is. But it has the list of possible keys, and then it has a callback function for each one, which then that callback function takes care of validating. So for example, for the mode one, it validates that what you put was actually an octal mode, and if not, yells at you. And if it is, it stores it into the object with mode equals that value. Partly because UCL doesn't have a native type for an octal file mode, and so we had to do the validation separately. And because this allowed me to just take the original parser and break it up into pieces and sort it out.
Is that a thing that we might want to add to UCL? I guess other file.
Yeah, other common key types. What's that?
Other config files might want to have.
Yeah, things like, yeah. Well, you can do it as a string and then treat it special in, but yes, if it had a type for that.
I want to be able to support the octal for or
Yeah.
RWX with dashes.
Yes.
Have it just be a first class type.
Mm-hmm. I think that would be a good idea.
Is the UCL also listed?
I don't think he can hear you.
Issue on GitHub.
Velisavod? They were asking about having a UCL type for file modes, where it could be like 755 or RWX, RW dash, or whatever. Do you think that's a good idea or not?
I actually no opinion on this. The problem is that it could be specified in octal number, as flags, as username. Somehow, maybe it's POSIX ACLs, so they can contain more than a single Unix permissions. They can contain lists of permissions. I don't know.
Maybe
I have no opinion on this.
Yeah. Because that's what ZFS uses, and yeah. So that gets complicated pretty quick.
It's not mainly complicated. It's very system dependent.
Yeah,
And I just don't know how to pass this.
right.
And
But
there is
we could just do file mode, I suppose. There.
The best way is to pass this as string,
Yeah,
and afterwards to do whatever you like.
yeah, right.
So what about the length of the config file? I mean, I like the fact that this is very easy to read and follow, but it's essentially going to take a 50-line file with comments and blank line strings and make it 500, probably.
I don't think it's quite 500, but I see your point. Is that a big deal?
It could be nice to have like a specification at the top that says, all right, I'm going to give you a list of things, and there are 6 things in each thing, but at least we have names for them now. Something like C++11 initializer lists, where somewhere you still have to provide the explicit names for all these fields, but you can also initialize an array of them very tersely if you so
Possibly. The other thing that the original new syslog supports that I haven't put in my patch yet is you can actually define a default. So at the top of that config file, you would have default, this is what the default mode is going to be, this is the default user, and every other object inherits all of those and only has to specify the ones where it's different than the default. And that would remove a bunch of the keys from every one of the sections.
that'd be really good, actually.
Yeah. I didn't know how to do that before, but I do now. So I just have to update the patch. So this is it actually doing the parsing. So like I said, there's this little map I made that has each key mapping to the callback that I wrote for it. But it just makes a new UCL parser that treats all keys as lowercase. So the user in the config file can write them in whatever case they want, but we treat them all as lowercase so that I can do strcomp faster. We parse it, throw an error if it didn't work, and then we iterate over the root object, which will be full of these keys, one for each log file that we want to parse. And then we just do, here's the one. If the key name is default, then we need to handle it in a special way, which obviously doesn't exist yet. But for the rest of them, it prints out some stuff if you're in debug mode, but it iterates through each of the things, calls the callback, and then at the end, loads all that into the C struct that new syslog has used to store its config file previously, and then continues on with the rest of the code in new syslog unmodified. So we're just replacing the function that loaded the struct before with my new function that loads the struct based on UCL instead of the original config. Does a little bit of special handling for flags such as please don't send a signal to the process that owns this log file. And then it adds it to the new syslog work queue and continues. So it's a fairly simple patch and just needs a little bit of polish, and it should be ready to go. But yeah, there's some concern about the size of the config file, but in the end, the readability might be worth the extra couple of bytes.
Anyway, you can just emit this configuration to something like message pack.
Yeah.
And it would be much smaller than the original configuration file.
Right, and because UCL can read all of that, if you were building an embedded appliance where every byte of space, you only have 6 megabyte compressed disk image to fit the entire system on, then using something like message pack or an NV list as the compiled down version of the config lets you save that space but still be able to have the human representation when you write it originally, or that you're generating it from in the build system or whatever. And then for Beehive, I used a slightly different approach. So with Beehive, originally the way you had to do it was you had basically Beehive took all of its parameters on the command line, and so you end up with like a command line about this big. So instead, you can just put it in UCL. So what I did to start was I did etc defaults beehive.conf, which I think is what you're looking at now. Yes, which then includes everything in beehive.conf.d and the original beehive.conf. And then it sets, in this case, everything defined in the root namespace of the config file is a default that every VM will inherit. And then you create VMs in their own sections and only have to specify the properties that you want to change. So if you want more than one CPU, then you would specify that. But any setting you don't specify falls back to that set of defaults. And so in this case, Beehive didn't actually have a struct for its config anywhere in it. It was just kind of a mishmash of local variables that would then get passed to the function that says, go set up a disk for me, and a couple of global variables. So Marcelo and I came up with a struct for it. It's in here somewhere. It's slightly large, but here it is. So it contains all the possible settings for a Beehive, starting with the name, number of CPUs, memory, etc., and all the devices, and then replaced the references to all those variables elsewhere.
Why not just keeping the objects instead of creating your own C structure? Just keep the object in the memory, and then you do some XPath-like request when you need one of the field.
That mostly, yeah.
I mean, you just validate that the configuration file is valid through the schema validation, and then when you need something, you know it's there. So you need something, you just look up into the object directly.
That has a little bit of issues with having the default and then the override, because the override won't have it, although you probably could use UCL's includes to solve that problem. Yep. That might actually be a better approach.
If you have a default somewhere, then you do a lookup in your version. If the thing is not there, then you format the default.
Yeah.
It also depends on how you want to do errors. If you're saying, here's the schema for my data, and this is how the order in your organization that it has to pair with, then going and doing piecemeal queries won't enforce that schema.
Right. Although UCL has a separate schema thing where we could validate the schema when we load the config and then know that it's good before we continue in the first place. Part of it was written this way because I started on someone else's patch that was already there, and then it added the struct. And the other thing is, partly it was because of the way Beehive was already written. As you can see, for example, if you specified the flag -u, it set guest UUID stir, and that was later called when it did it. And so I just replaced it there.
So this looks kind of ugly.
This is what was already there. I didn't add that.
Yeah, but I don't know if you've looked at how NextStep did this and how
No.
OS10 does it now. They have the NS user default system, which reuses all of their property list parsing infrastructure, and it composes multiple domains. So you have a global system domain, then you have a user domain, but then the top level one is the arguments domain. And so any key that you specify in something that's stored in user defaults can be overridden on the command line, and that is really useful.
Yes.
It means you never write command line parsing code. You just say, I have named my properties sensibly in the configuration. Now I have command line parsing for free.
Yeah. Sadly, the Beehive guys couldn't be here today, so we could talk to them about how horrible their command line parsing is. But
this is how command line parsing in traditional Unix stuff looks. It's just Next did this better in 1988, and now we have libraries that do the same sort of things that they were doing, but better. It would be nice to use them.
Well, yes, because the other half of the problem is this is what the config parsing code that loads it from UCL into the struct looks like, which is a giant else if ladder of stir comps, and that's not very much fun either. I'm not sure why there's stir case comps when we're using all lowercase keys, so they couldn't ever be anything but lowercase. But again, I didn't write all of this patch, but Marcelo couldn't be here. So yes, this could be done better as well. But the bigger issue that I need to address is just how exactly to lay out the config file for Beehive, because I kind of changed my mind halfway through doing it about what made sense and what didn't. But in order to decide what the config file should look like for Beehive, I think should start by kind of having an idea of what makes a good config file and what we would like all config files to look like, and having kind of a common structure that would be common to all config files. Because using UCL for every config file in the base system is great, but if we use it differently in each utility, we haven't gained that much ground. So does anybody have a wish list for how they would like config files to look like or be? Other than being easy to read, write, and parse and edit?
I'd say the most important thing about a config file is that it should always start at empty. And if I don't have a config file there, that's the default configuration. And if I put an empty config file there, that's the same as not having a config file. And then I should be able to change one thing by adding one line, and
Yes.
the second thing by adding another line.
Yeah, and that's part of the, although in the way I envisioned it, yes, new syslog.conf in etc would ship as empty, and the defaults would be defined in etc defaults new syslog.conf. That then includes an override. Something to that.
That people won't touch. Well,
Yeah,
somewhere that
so-
people won't touch, but somewhere that they can read.
Yeah,
Yeah, so
exactly. And then it includes the possibly empty file with a try include or whatever. And yes, any setting you set there has a higher priority and overrides anything from the defaults. And yeah, you get away from this whole editing this giant file full of stuff. And you can just specify the 1 or 2 keys you need, or exactly. This is what I wanted. I just wanted my new syslog.conf to contain messages count equals 30, closing bracket. It's like I just want to change this one file to have the one field different, and that's it.
you also get rid of the merge problem on upgrades.
Yes, you avoid the merge problem if you didn't touch the original files. And that would make Baptiste happy, right?
Oh yeah.
And I think David's point about unifying configuration with that other kind of configuration, which is what we type in command line, is also a really, I mean, it's not something that you're going to enforce everywhere
Right.
from the get-go, but if you make it easy to do it that way, then people will do something that gets us to a nicer place.
What would be really nice would be if you say libucl, here is my config file, here is my RT.
Yeah. And it would just do, long ops on everything, and minus key equals blah would.
And
Yeah.
the help outputs.
Hmm?
Because it's boring to write the help outputs.
Yeah.
It's never in sync with the code.
And
Yes.
generic amount.
Yes. That's one of the things on the to-do list is to fix up the man page for libucl. I'm as guilty as anybody for adding more functionality and not putting it in the man page.
But since we have this nice way of describing structured tree-like things, it would actually be nice to have a tool that would, you give it the description of a config file with comments and things saying and have it generate the C struct, and have it generate the code that will construct the C struct, and have it generate the man page that describes what each configuration option is.
Yeah.
Because if you're writing a schema that says this configuration option goes here and this is the documentation for it, then that gets spat out in the help messages and it goes on the man page.
Does all the stuff. Yeah. Steve?
Well, I really like David's point about having the config updated as you change things in commandless. But I wanted to ask about what the implications of this changing the config files is for merge master and kind of the upgrade process, and if we can use this to kind of get rid of that whole process, maybe.
That's part of the idea, is that the files that the user modifies start out empty, and the defaults that they're not supposed to touch go over here.
Right.
So you never modify, you never have to merge.
Yeah.
Well,
You can just overwrite the defaults with whatever
You always overwrite the default.
Yeah.
And you don't touch the user's file,
Exactly.
which overwrites.
so the merge master completely goes away.
Well, you still need merge master for like your password file for creating new users and a couple of special circumstances.
It should be fixed through NSS.
Yeah. Or something.
Yeah, it's not, but
Yeah.
it should be.
Yeah.
Or someone has to do it.
But yes, that's one of the reasons why I looked at for new syslog still supporting the old format, because I don't feel like writing something that will parse your old new syslog.conf and rewrite it as UCL and overwrite it on you or something.
The only wrong thing about being able to pass it to the config file which is there for the syslog is that you will have the default header somewhere, and the default will have the correct header. So you will always find a valid UCL configuration, so you never read your version of the new syslog file.
Yes, if we change new syslog to look in etc defaults new syslog.conf instead of the etc one. Yeah. One of many issues that we'll have to address. Yeah. I hadn't thought of that. That's a good point.
So at the moment,
Mhm.
if I write a config file that's meant to override just one element in the default config file, do I need to, in my config file, specify, all right, first include the defaults, or do you always include the defaults and then I smoosh on top of them?
It kind of depends how we want to do it. The way I think makes most sense is the program always parses the defaults file, and at the end of the defaults file you have an include statement that says include with a higher priority than we're currently using this file over here, like etc new syslog.conf.
The other approach is to have the default hard-coded into the program itself, and the program has a dump command line that is able to show you the default so that you can read it, or show you the modified version.
But
The
I
line
think it might
passes.
actually make more sense if you had with the paths thing, here are a bunch of places where you can
Yeah.
find johnsapp.ucl and load all of them in the correct order.
For instance,
Yep.
I'm right now writing a tool to be able to switch the toolchain very transparently and use UCL as an icon. Basically what I do is I create a very, very small string where I just push all those paths that includes, so that the first thing is I don't read any existing file on the file system. I just say parse this small UCL file which itself includes the file to the right places. So by default you don't have a configuration file, but you're still looking at the different places for the different available version of your toolchain configuration.
Ooh, that's another one. Can I pass a little scrap of UCL directly as a command line argument?
Would be nice.
You can, in the C API, you can parse a string as UCL. So yes.
Data injection, anyone?
Pardon?
Data injection, anyone?
Well, I mean, so for instance, I have some command line arguments, and once I
Yeah, no.
start becoming complicated, I want to put structure in them. And
Yep.
again,
Postfix has an interesting way of doing it. It passes all the source files, gather the different configuration variables that it can handle, and write the postconf utility. And you can ask postconf to generate all the default values and all the different values from the default files,
Yep.
which is very interesting to create a new file. You just to know exactly what has changed compared to the
configuration.
You say, give me all of my values that are different than the defaults.
Yes.
It's in my set of slides for Saturday for my actual talk that, especially if we're creating this thing where we're going to read etc defaults new syslog.conf and then etc new syslog.conf and then etc new syslog.d/star.conf and user local etc new syslog.d.star blah, that you are going to want a tool like that, or Samba has one as well, like test parm or something like that, would spit out what the final configuration was actually going to look like after you've included all of those chunks. And I hadn't thought of having an option of excluding the defaults from that somehow.
And for which file has provided you
With
final
which,
version, so that
yes.
you know if something is wrong, which file you want to drop.
Yeah, which file did it come from? And the other issue currently is with the idea of using the pass and including all the files with the glob keyword is if you don't, when you're doing that, you can only set one priority. And so if you have two different files you're including at the same time, if the priorities match, the default in libucl is to create an implicit array, basically keeping both values. And we might want a flag that says, in this case, just always take the last one. Keep letting the later ones overwrite the older ones. In the cases where we're not specifically setting a priority that this is higher or lower priority than this other thing.
It seems like there will be something in the syntax that tells you whether it's an array or not. Includes you to say, this is something.
Well,
Field of a variable, which is a.
yeah.
It might be worth having the break now, so
Yeah.
the schedule time for the break. And
Yes.
people can digest and think and then come back and tell you everything you've done wrong.
Yes, please. Thank you. OK, break time.